The screams had stopped. That's what terrified him most, as Marco Delacroix stood outside the bedroom door of their penthouse, his hand frozen on the handle. Not the screaming itself, though those sounds would haunt him for the rest of his life, but the sudden, awful silence that followed. He'd been in his home office, door closed, on what he'd called the most important conference call of his career. The Valencio deal. 5 years of negotiation, hundreds of millions of dollars, expansion into 3 new territories. His phone had been on silent. His focus had been absolute. His ambition had been everything. And somewhere beyond that closed door, his wife Isabel had been dying. When he finally opened the bedroom door, the scene that greeted him would be burned into his memory forever. Isabel lay pale and still on their bed, her nightgown soaked with blood, one hand still, clutching her swollen belly where their daughter had been growing for 8 months. Her eyes were open but unfocused, her breathing shallow and labored. The phone on the nightstand showed 17 missed calls. All to him, all ignored. The paramedics were working frantically, but Marco could see it in their faces. They'd arrived too late. He'd called them too late. He'd emerged from his office too late, drawn finally by a silence more terrible than any scream. "Sir, we need to get her to the hospital now," one of the paramedics said urgently. "She's lost a significant amount of blood. Baby, we can't detect a heartbeat." Marco felt the world tilt beneath him. "What? Your wife has been in crisis for over an hour. Sir, did you not hear her calling for help? An hour." He'd been on his conference call for an hour and 7 minutes. He'd heard nothing. Or rather, he'd heard something distant, sounds that he'd dismissed as Isabel watching television too loudly. Sounds that had annoyed him enough to close his office door more firmly so he could concentrate on his deal. Those sounds had been his wife screaming for help while their baby died inside her. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Marco rode in the ambulance, holding Isabel's cold hand, watching machines measure the fading rhythm of her life. She didn't speak, didn't look at him, just stared at the ceiling of the ambulance with eyes that had gone somewhere far away, somewhere he couldn't reach her. "Isabel, baby, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please hold on." But she didn't respond. Maybe she couldn't hear him over the sirens. Or maybe she could hear him perfectly well and had simply run out of reasons to answer. At the hospital, they took her away immediately, rushing her into emergency surgery. Marco was left alone in a waiting room, his hands still stained with his wife's blood, his $1,000 suit ruined, his mind replaying those 17 missed calls over and over and over. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and finally listened to the voicemails. The first one, time-stamped 43 minutes ago. Marco, something's wrong. I'm bleeding. Please, I need you to come. I need." Her voice cut off with a gasp of pain. The second, 3 minutes later. "Marco, please. It hurts so much. The baby isn't moving. Marco, please pick up." The third, desperation turning to anguish. "I'm calling an ambulance. Where are you? Why won't you answer me?" By the 7th call, her voice was barely a whisper. "Marco, I think our baby is gone. I think she's gone. And I'm so cold. I'm so cold and I'm all alone." The remaining 10 calls were silent. Just the sound of labored breathing and quiet crying, as if she'd given up on reaching him but couldn't bring herself to hang up. As if the open line was the last thread connecting her to the man who'd promised to love and protect her. Marco dropped the phone, buried his face in his bloody hands, and wept. Isabel Delacroix had known what she was getting into when she married Marco. Or at least, I thought she knew. Everyone had warned her. Her mother, her friends, even Marco himself had tried to explain what life would be like married to a man like him. Marco Delacroix wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful in ways that made wealthy men nervous. He controlled the ports in 3 cities, had politicians in his pocket, and ran an empire that existed in the shadows between legal and illegal, legitimate and dangerous. But Isabel had been 24 and in love, and Marco at 29 had been charming and attentive in a way that made her feel like the center of his universe. He'd pursued her relentlessly after they met at a charity gala where she'd been working as an event coordinator. Flowers every day for 3 weeks, private dinners on rooftops overlooking the city, weekend getaways to his villa in the countryside. "I've never met anyone like you," he'd told her on their 3rd date, his dark eyes intense in the candlelight. Everyone in my world wants something from me. Power, money, connections. You just want to know if I prefer Italian or French cuisine. You have no idea how extraordinary that is. She'd laughed. Maybe I'm just a really good actress, and I'm actually after your money. Then you're playing a very long game, Bella. Most people show their true colors within an hour. They'd married 6 months later in a small ceremony, small by Marco's standards, which still meant 200 guests and a reception that cost more than Isabel had earned in 3 years of event planning. Her mother had cried, though Isabel had never been sure if they were tears of joy or worry. The first year had been good. Marco had been attentive, loving, protective, without being possessive. But then the business started expanding, demanding more of his time and attention. By their second anniversary, Isabel was eating dinner alone more nights than not, sleeping in an empty bed in their massive penthouse, wondering when exactly she'd become just another piece of expensive furniture in Marco's carefully curated life. When she'd found out she was pregnant, she'd been terrified and elated in equal measure. Terrified because she wasn't sure she could raise a child essentially alone. Elated because surely a baby would remind Marco of what mattered. Surely their daughter would bring him home. She'd told him over dinner one of the rare evenings he'd actually made it home before midnight. She'd cooked his favorite meal, had dressed carefully, and rehearsed the words a dozen times. Marco, I have something to tell you. He'd looked up from his phone, his attention only half present. What is it, Bella? I'm pregnant. We're having Way. A baby. For a moment, his face had transformed. Pure joy, wonder, love, everything she'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. He'd swept her into his arms, spinning her around, laughing like a child. A baby? Truly? Isabel, this is incredible. That night had been perfect. They'd made love slowly, carefully. Marco's hands gentle on her still flat stomach, his lips whispering promises to their daughter. Promises about family dinners and bedtime stories, about teaching her to ride horses at the villa, about being present for every milestone. Isabel had believed every word. The first month had been good. Marco had come home earlier, had attended her first prenatal appointment, had spent evenings researching nursery furniture and debating paint colors. But by the second month, the business had pulled him back in. A territorial dispute with a rival family. Problems with a shipping contract. Concerns about federal investigation into his legitimate holdings. Just until this blows over, he'd promised, kissing her forehead as he left for another emergency meeting. Then things will calm down, and I'll be around more, I promise. By the 3rd month, Isabel had stopped believing his promises. By the 5th month, she'd stopped expecting him to keep them. By the 7th month, she'd stopped asking him to try. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Isabel's blood pressure had been elevated, her doctor warning about preeclampsia and the need for rest and reduced stress. The baby's position had been concerning, potentially requiring a cesarean section. Every appointment had brought new worries, new complications, new reasons why Isabel needed support. Marco had missed every appointment after the first one. I'm sorry, Bella, he'd say. When she'd mention it later, something came up. You know how it is. Did the doctor say everything was okay? She'd stopped telling him when things weren't okay. What was the point? He'd just apologize, promise to do better, and then disappear into his office or his business for days at a time. The night it all fell apart had started like any other lonely evening in Isabel's carefully constructed prison of luxury. Marco had been home, technically. He'd arrived at 7, kissed her cheek absently, and disappeared into his home office with barely a word. She'd heard his voice through the door, that commanding tone he used when negotiating, when exerting his will, when reminding people exactly who held the power. Isabel had made herself dinner, eaten alone at their ridiculously long dining table, and retreated to their bedroom. At 8 months pregnant, she was exhausted all the time. Her back ached. Her feet were swollen. The baby had been unusually quiet all day, which worried her more than she wanted to admit. She'd tried to rest, but the cramping had started around 8 o'clock. Nothing too serious at first, but by 8:30, the pain had intensified. By 8:45, she'd noticed the bleeding. Isabel had grabbed her phone immediately, her hands shaking as she dialed Marco's number. It had rung once, twice, then gone to voicemail. She'd tried again. Voicemail. The cramping was getting worse, sharp pains that took her breath away. The bleeding was increasing. Something was very Very wrong. Isabel had struggled out of bed, calling Marco's name as she made her way toward his office. But the penthouse was large, and his office was at the far end, and the pain was making it hard to move, hard to think, hard to do anything but focus on staying conscious. "Marco!" she'd screamed, pounding on his office door. "Marco, please! Something's wrong with the baby!" No response. She could hear his voice inside, animated and energized, discussing terms and territories and things that mattered more than his wife's desperate pleas. Isabel had tried the handle, but the door was locked. He locked it sometimes during important calls. She knew. Privacy. Concentration. The world outside that door ceased to exist when Marco Delacroix was conducting business, including his pregnant wife bleeding in the hallway. She'd called his phone again and again, 11 times in total, leaving voicemails that progressed from worried to terrified to resigned. She'd called emergency services on her 12th call, her voice barely audible as she gave them the address and tried to explain what was happening. "My baby," she'd whispered to the dispatcher. "I can't feel my baby moving anymore." The paramedics had arrived 14 minutes later. By then, Isabel had crawled back to the bedroom, leaving a trail of blood across their expensive marble floors. By then, the cramping had become agony. By then, she'd known with terrible certainty that their daughter was gone. And through it all, Marco had remained in his office, door closed, phone on silent, completely unaware that his world was ending just 30 feet away. Dr. Sarah Chen had been a trauma surgeon for 15 years. She'd seen terrible things, had delivered devastating news to countless families, had learned to maintain professional composure in the face of unimaginable tragedy. But there was something about Marco Delacroix's case that shook even her practiced calm. She found him in the surgical waiting room, still covered in his wife's blood, his expensive suit jacket discarded on the chair beside him. He looked up when she entered, and she saw in his eyes the desperate hope of a man who knew he was about to hear the worst news of his life, but couldn't quite accept it yet. "Mr. Delacroix," she began gently, taking the seat across from him. "Your wife is out of surgery. She's stable, but the baby?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Dr. Chen took a breath. "I'm so sorry. Your daughter didn't survive. The placental abruption was severe and had been progressing for at least an hour before your wife received medical attention. By the time the paramedics arrived, there was no fetal heartbeat. We did everything we could, but..." Marco made a sound like he'd been shot. A raw, wounded noise that had nothing to do with the dangerous man he was and everything to do with the father he'd never get to be. "How?" he managed. "How did this happen?" Placental abruption can occur suddenly, though in your wife's case, there were likely warning signs earlier in the pregnancy. Elevated blood pressure, stress, certain complications, all of these increase the risk. "Mr. Delacroix, your wife's medical records show she'd been flagged as high risk since her second trimester. Were you aware of this?" Marco closed his eyes. He hadn't been aware. Isabel had told him. He was sure, but he couldn't remember the conversation. Couldn't remember because he'd probably been on his phone, or thinking about business, or only half listening, because he'd assumed everything would be fine. "And Isabel?" he asked, afraid of the answer. Will she? Your wife survived, but she's suffered significant trauma, both physical and psychological. She'll need extensive recovery time. Mr. Delacroix, I need you to understand something." Dr. Chen's voice became firmer. "Your wife called for help repeatedly. She experienced this crisis alone, without support, while hemorrhaging and in extreme pain. The psychological impact of that experience, combined with the loss of your daughter, is going to require serious intervention. Can I see her? She's sedated right now. And honestly, I'm not sure she'll want to see you when she wakes up." "Doctor." Chen's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of anger. "Mr. Delacroix, I've been a doctor for a long time. I've seen a lot of tragic situations, but what I can't understand is how a woman could be screaming for help in her own home, calling her husband 17 times in an hour, and somehow not be heard." The judgment in her voice was clear, and Marco didn't defend himself. He couldn't. There was no defense for what he'd done. The paramedics found your wife alone, in extreme distress, having lost dangerous amounts of blood. They found a trail of blood leading from one end of your home to the other, suggesting she'd tried to reach you and failed. "Mr. Delacroix, where exactly were you while your wife was dying?" "In my office," he said, his voice hollow. On a space. Conference call. I had the door closed. I didn't hear her. Dr. Chen stared at him for a long moment. You didn't hear your wife screaming for help because you closed the door? When she said it like that, the enormity of his failure became undeniable. I want to see her, he said again. Please, I need to see her. Dr. Chen stood. I'll take you to her room. But Mr. Delacroix, understand this. Your wife has just been through one of the most traumatic experiences a woman can endure. She lost her baby while completely alone, believing that the father of her child couldn't be bothered to answer her calls. Whatever relationship you had before tonight, it's not the same relationship you have now. Isabel was so pale she almost disappeared against the white hospital sheets. Marco stood in the doorway of her room, unable to move closer, unable to look away. She was hooked up to multiple IVs, monitors beeping steadily, measuring vital signs that had nearly ceased hours ago. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and spread across the pillow. Her hands rested on her now flat stomach, as if searching for the life that was no longer there. She was awake, staring at the ceiling with eyes that held nothing at all. Isabel? Marco's voice cracked on her name. Slowly, she turned her head to look at him. For a moment, he thought he saw recognition. Then her expression went blank again, as if she were looking through him rather than at him. The deal, she said finally, her voice hoarse from screaming. Did you close the deal? The question hit him like a physical blow. Bella, I did. You. Close. The deal. Each word was enunciated carefully, precisely, as if she were speaking a foreign language. Yes, he whispered, shame burning through him. But Isabel, I would give anything. Good. She turned her face back to the ceiling. Then her death meant something. At least one of us served a purpose tonight. Don't say that. Please, Bella, don't. Her name was going to be Sophia, Isabel continued, as if he hadn't spoken. I'd picked it out months ago. I told you, but you probably don't remember. You never remembered anything, I said. Sophia Rose Delacroix. We'd been carrying her for 8 months, Marco. 8 months. And she died alone, just like her mother almost did. I'm sorry, Marco said, tears streaming down his face. God, Isabel, I'm so sorry. I would give everything I have, to go back and what? She finally looked at him again, and this time there was emotion in her eyes. Rage. Open the door? Answer your phone? Care enough to notice that your wife was dying 30 feet away? Which one, Marco? Which basic act of human decency would you choose? He had no answer. No excuse. No defense. I called and called. Isabel continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. And you know what I realized? That you weren't going to answer. That whatever you were doing in that office was more important than me. More important than our daughter. More important than the family you promised you wanted to build. That's not true. Isabel, you and Sophia are everything to me. Sophia is dead. The words exploded from her, raw and terrible. Our daughter is dead because you couldn't be bothered to unlock a door. She died while you were talking about territories and shipping routes and money. So don't you dare stand there and tell me we meant everything to you. A nurse rushed in, alarmed by Isabel's elevated heart rate on the monitors. Mrs. Delacroix, you need to stay calm. Your blood pressure. Get him out, Isabel said, her eyes locked on Marco. Get him out of my room. Get him out of my sight. Get him away from me before I do something we'll both regret. Bella, please, get out. The scream tore from her throat, and suddenly she was sobbing, her whole body shaking with the force of her grief. Get out, get out, get out. I never want to see you again. You let our baby die. You let her die. The nurse was ushering Marco toward the door, another staff member rushing in to help calm Isabel. He could hear her screaming even as they forced him out into the hallway, primal sounds of anguish that would echo in his nightmares for years to come. Security escorted him to the waiting area, their firm grip on his arms suggesting that leaving wasn't optional. Marco didn't resist. He was numb, hollowed out, a shell of the powerful man who'd walked into this hospital hours ago. His daughter was dead. His wife hated him, and he had no one to blame but himself. Marco didn't leave the hospital. Security had escorted him out of Isabel's room, out of the surgical wing, and strongly suggested he go home. But he couldn't. He sat in the main waiting area for 3 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, waiting for any news about Isabel's condition that the medical staff was under strict orders not to share with him. On the second day, Isabel's mother arrived. Catherine Laurent had never liked Marco. She'd been polite at the wedding, cordial, at family gatherings, but there had always been a distance in her eyes when she looked at him, as if she could see through the charm and wealth to the darkness underneath. Now, as she walked through the hospital lobby and spotted him slumped in a chair, still wearing the same blood-stained clothes, that distance had transformed into pure hatred. "You," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the waiting room. "You killed my granddaughter." Marco stood, his legs unsteady. "Mrs. Laurent, The slap came so fast he didn't see it coming. His head snapped to the side, and he tasted blood where his teeth had cut the inside of his cheek. Several people in the waiting room gasped. But Marco didn't move, didn't defend himself. He deserved worse than a slap. "My daughter called you," Catherine continued, her voice shaking with rage. "She called you while she was bleeding, while her baby was dying inside her, and you were too busy to answer. What kind of man does that? What kind of monster?" "I didn't know," Marco said weakly. "I didn't hear. You didn't want to hear. You never wanted to hear anything that interfered with your precious business," Isabel told me. "You know, every lonely dinner, every missed appointment, every broken promise. She made excuses for you because she loved you, and this is how you repaid that love? By letting her suffer alone?" Marco's legs gave out, and he sank back into the chair. "How is she?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How do you think she is?" "She lost her baby. The baby she carried for 8 months, planned for, dreamed about. The baby that died while she screamed your name, and you couldn't be bothered to open a door." Catherine's eyes were filled with tears now. "The doctors say she's stable, physically, but emotionally, psychologically, she won't speak. She just stares at the wall. My daughter has disappeared inside herself, and it's your fault. I want to help her. Whatever she needs. What she needs is for you to disappear. What she needs is to never see your face again. What she needs is to grieve without having to look at the man who killed her child through sheer negligence." "Sophia," Marco said, his voice breaking. "Her name was Sophia. Isabel told me months ago, and I forgot, but I remember now. Our daughter's name was Sophia." Catherine's expression softened slightly, but only slightly. "Too little. Too late, Mr. Delacroix. You don't get to grieve with us. You don't get to pretend you cared when your actions proved otherwise." She turned to leave, then paused. "I'm taking Isabel home with me when she's discharged. To my house, not your penthouse. Don't try to contact her. Don't send flowers or gifts or whatever guilt-driven gesture you think will fix this. There is no fixing this. You had one job as a husband and father to protect your family, and when they needed you most, you chose a conference call." Marco watched her walk away, heading toward Isabel's room where he wasn't allowed. He sat back down in his chair, dropped his head into his hands, and finally, truly understood what he'd lost. Everything. He'd lost everything. The funeral for Sophia Rose Delacroix was small and private, held in a cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Marco stood at a distance, watching from behind a tree as Isabel laid their daughter to rest. He hadn't been invited. Catherine had made it clear he wasn't welcome, but he'd come anyway, needing to say goodbye to the child he'd never held, never kissed, never had the chance to love the way she'd deserved. Isabel looked like a ghost in her black dress, leaning heavily on her mother for support. She didn't cry during the service, didn't speak, just stood there with that same empty expression she'd worn in the hospital, as if she'd used up all her tears and had nothing left to give. When it was over, when the small white casket had been lowered into the ground, and the gathered friends and family had begun to disperse, Isabel remained. She stood at the edge of the grave, staring down at the place where their daughter would rest forever. Marco couldn't help himself. He stepped out from behind the tree and started walking toward her, drawn by some desperate need to share this moment of grief, to not let her stand alone again. Catherine saw him first. She moved to intercept him, her face furious, but Isabel held up a hand to stop her mother. "It's fine," Isabel said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Let him come." Marco approached slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might make her change her mind. When he reached her side, he looked down into the grave at the small casket that held all his broken dreams. "She would have been beautiful," he said softly. "Like her mother." "She was beautiful," Isabel corrected, her voice hollow. I held her, you know. After they delivered her. They let me hold her for an hour. She had your nose, your dark hair. She would have had your eyes, I think. Bella, don't call me that, she interrupted sharply. You lost the right to call me that. They stood in silence for a long moment. Two people who'd created life together now, standing over that life's grave, separated by a chasm that felt unbridgeable. I'm going away, Isabel finally said. My mother is taking me to her house in Maine. I need to be somewhere far from this city, far from that penthouse, far from you. For how long? Forever, probably. I've asked my lawyer to begin divorce proceedings. The words hit him like bullets, even though he'd been expecting them. Isabel, please. I know I failed you. I know I failed Sophia. But, please, give me a chance to what? She turned to look at him for the first time, and he almost wished she hadn't. Her eyes held no anger anymore, no grief, no emotion at all, just emptiness. To prove you've changed? To show me you can be better? Marco, our daughter is dead. There's no coming back from that. There's no second chance when the first chance cost a life. I love you, he said desperately. I know I didn't show it, didn't prove it when it mattered, but I do love you, both of you. I would give anything. You can't give anything, Isabel said quietly. There's nothing left to give. Sophia is gone. And the woman who loved you, who believed in you, who waited for you to come home every night? She's gone too. She died in that bedroom while you were on your conference call. I'm just what's left. She turned away from him, back to the grave. I don't hate you, Marco. I wish I did. Hate would at least be something, some emotion that meant I still cared enough to feel. But I don't. I'm empty. You emptied me out when you chose business over family for the last time. So please, just go. Let me bury our daughter in peace. Marco wanted to argue, to beg, to fall to his knees and plead for forgiveness. But the deadness in her eyes stopped him. She was right. The woman he'd married was gone, killed by his neglect as surely as his daughter had been. He walked away, leaving Isabel alone at Sophia's grave. When he looked back from the cemetery gates, she was kneeling in the grass, her hand pressed against the fresh earth, finally crying. He'd done that to her. He'd broken something so fundamental that even tears had taken days to return, and he had no idea how to fix it, or if it could even be fixed at all. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum. Marco wandered through rooms that suddenly seemed too large, too empty, too full of ghosts. The nursery they'd been decorating was the worst pale yellow walls, a crib that would never be used, stuffed animals that would never be loved. He stood in the doorway for an hour, unable to enter, unable to look away. This was supposed to be Sophia's room. This was where he'd planned to read her bedtime stories, to rock her to sleep, to watch her grow. All those futures he'd taken for granted, all those moments he'd assumed would happen, were gone, erased by 1 hour of neglect. His phone rang. Vincent, his right-hand man. Boss, we need to talk about the Valencio deal. There are some complications with... Marco hung up without a word. He stared at the phone in his hand, the same phone that had been on silent while Isabel called 17 times. The same phone that had prioritized business calls over his wife's desperate pleas. He threw it against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces. Then he walked into his home office, the room where he'd sat while his family died, and began systematically destroying everything. The desk where he'd conducted that final conference call. The chair where he'd sat in oblivious comfort. The filing cabinets full of contracts and deals and business plans that had mattered more than his wife's screams. By the time he was finished, the office was destroyed, and his hands were bleeding from broken glass and splintered wood. But it didn't make him feel better. Nothing could make him feel better. Because Sophia was still dead, and Isabel was still broken, and no amount of destruction could change what he'd done. His personal physician, Dr. Michael Romano, came by the next day, summoned by Vincent, who was concerned about Marco's state of mind. You look terrible, Dr. Romano said bluntly, examining Marco's cut hands. When's the last time you slept? 8? I don't know, Marco admitted. He was sitting in the living room, staring at nothing, his mind replaying that night over and over. What does it matter? It matters because you're no good to anyone dead, including your wife. My wife is leaving me. She's filing for divorce. She won't even speak to me. Dr. Romano finished bandaging Marco's hands in silence. Then he sat back and looked at his patient with the frank honesty of someone who'd known him for 20 years. I heard what happened, Marco. About the baby. About Isabel being in crisis while you were on a business call. Is it true? Every word, Marco said hollowly. Then I'm not going to pretend to understand what you're going through. Because honestly, I can't fathom how a man doesn't hear his wife screaming for help in his own home. The judgment in his voice was clear, and Marco didn't defend himself. He was tired of defending himself, tired of making excuses. But, Dr. Romano continued, I've known you long enough to know you're not a cruel man. Negligent, yes. Selfish, absolutely. But not intentionally cruel. So I'm going to tell you something important, and I need you to listen. Marco looked up at him. Your wife is suffering from severe trauma. She experienced one of the worst things that can happen to a woman losing a child during pregnancy while completely alone and unsupported. That kind of psychological damage doesn't just heal with time. She's going to need serious help. Therapy, medication, probably years of recovery. I'll pay for anything she needs, Marco said immediately. The best therapists, the best. That's not the point, Dr. Romano interrupted. Money can't fix this. Your attention can't fix this. Nothing you do right now can fix this. Your wife needs space to grieve and heal, without the constant reminder of what caused her trauma. I caused her trauma. Yes, you did. And the kindest thing you can do right now is give her the distance she's asking for. Let her go to Maine with her mother. Let her process this without you hovering, trying to fix something that can't be fixed with grand gestures. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. So I just give up? Marco asked, something almost like anger flickering in his chest. I just let her leave and never see her again? No, you work on yourself. You figure out how you became the kind of man who could ignore his wife's desperate calls. You get therapy. You examine your priorities. You become someone worthy of a second chance, even if that second chance never comes. Dr. Romano stood to leave, then paused at the door. Marco, I've seen you build an empire from nothing. I've seen you survive things that would break most men. But this is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Because you can't threaten it, can't buy it, can't negotiate it. You can only do the work and hope that someday, somehow, your wife might be willing to forgive you. And honestly, she might never be able to. You need to accept that possibility. After he left, Marco sat alone in the ruins of his life and finally understood what Dr. Romano meant. He'd lost Isabel. He'd lost Sophia. And the only way forward, if there even was a way forward, was to become someone completely different from the man he'd been. The therapist's office was nothing like Marco expected. No leather couch, no notepad, just 2 comfortable chairs in a room painted soft blue, with windows overlooking a small garden. Dr. Sarah Brennan was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Marco of his grandmother. She'd been recommended by Dr. Romano as someone who specialized in trauma, grief, and what she called life-altering failures. I've lost people before, Marco told her during their first session. My father was murdered when I was 12. I've lost friends, colleagues. I understand death. But you don't understand culpability, Dr. Brennan said gently. You've never before been the direct cause of someone's death, especially not someone you loved. The words hit him hard, but they were true. His father's death had been senseless violence. The friends he'd lost had been casualties of the life they'd all chosen. But Sophia's death was different. Sophia's death was on him. Tell me about that night, Dr. Brennan said. Walk me through it from the beginning. Marco had told the story a dozen times to doctors, to Isabel's mother, to Vincent, to himself in the dark hours of the night. But this time, Dr. Brennan stopped him at crucial moments, asking questions that forced him to examine things he'd been avoiding. You said you heard sounds from the bedroom but thought it was the television. Why didn't you check? I was focused on the call. It was important. More important than making sure your pregnant wife was okay? No, of course not, but I didn't think. You didn't think. Let's examine that. Why didn't you think? The sessions were grueling. Dr. Brennan didn't let him hide behind excuses or rationalizations. She forced him to confront the truth, that he'd trained himself to prioritize business above everything else, that he'd spent years building an empire at the expense of his marriage, that he'd become so accustomed to Isabel's needs being secondary, that he'd literally tuned out her desperate screams. "You weren't a villain," Dr. Brennan explained during their 5th session. "You were negligent, and sometimes negligence is more dangerous than malice, because you can't see it happening. You convinced yourself that you were building an empire for your family, but really, you were building it instead of your family." "How do I fix it?" Marco asked desperately. "How do I become someone different?" "You start by accepting that you can't fix what happened. Sophia is dead. That's a fact that no amount of change or growth will alter. Isabel's trauma is real and permanent. You can't undo those things. Then what's the point? The point is that you can choose who you want to be going forward. Not to win Isabel back, that may never happen, but because it's the right thing to do. You can become someone who would never make that mistake again." Marco threw himself into the work of transformation with the same intensity he'd once directed toward his business empire. But this was harder than any negotiation, any territorial dispute, any business deal. This required him to be vulnerable. He started by stepping back from his organization. He promoted Vincent to handle day-to-day operations and reduced his own involvement to a few hours a week. The empire he'd built suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. What good was controlling 3 cities' worth of territory if he couldn't control his own demons? He attended grief counseling groups for parents who'd lost children. At first, he said nothing, just listened to other parents share their stories. A mother who'd lost her son to leukemia, a father whose daughter had died in a car accident, a couple whose baby had been stillborn. Their grief was as real as his, but there was something different in their stories. They'd done everything right. They'd been present, loving, attentive. Their children's deaths had been tragedies, random acts of a cruel universe. Sophia's death had been preventable, and everyone in the group knew it once he finally shared his story. "My daughter died because I was on a conference call," he'd said during his 3rd meeting, his voice hollow. "My wife called me 17 times begging for help, and I had my phone on silent. So I don't know if I belong here with people who actually loved their children." The silence that followed was heavy with judgment. Some people left the room, but others stayed, and one father, a man named Robert, whose son had died of SIDS, spoke up. "You loved your daughter," Robert said quietly. "You failed her catastrophically, but you loved her, and now you have to carry that failure for the rest of your life. That's your burden. But it doesn't mean you didn't love her." Those words broke something open in Marco. He'd been so focused on his negligence, on his failure, that he'd forgotten the love underneath. He had loved Sophia, had dreamed about her, planned for her, wanted desperately to be her father. He'd just been too broken, too consumed by his own ambitions to show that love when it mattered. The tears came then. Months' worth of grief he'd been holding back. He sobbed in a room full of strangers who understood loss in ways most people never would, and for the first time since that terrible night, he felt something other than numbness. He felt human again. Marco hired a private investigator not to spy on Isabel, but to make sure she was safe and had everything she needed. The reports came weekly. She was living with her mother in Maine. She was seeing a therapist 3 times a week. She was slowly starting to re-engage with life-taking walks, helping in her mother's garden, occasionally meeting with old friends. She was healing. Slowly. Without him, Marco respected her distance, but he couldn't stop himself from trying to support her from afar. He paid off Catherine's mortgage anonymously. He ensured that Isabel's medical bills were covered. He donated a significant sum to a pregnancy loss support organization in Sophia's name. Every month, on the anniversary of Sophia's death, he visited her grave. Sometimes he brought flowers. Sometimes he just sat in the grass and talked to his daughter, telling her about the man he was trying to become, apologizing for the father he'd never been. "Your mother is doing better," he told the small headstone one cold November morning, 6 months after the tragedy. "She's strong, Sophia. Stronger than I ever gave her credit for. She's going to be okay. I think, even without me. She asks about you, you know." Marco spun around to find Catherine standing a few feet away, wrapped in a heavy coat against the autumn chill. He stood quickly, brushing grass from his pants. "Mrs. Laurent, She doesn't admit it," Catherine continued, walking closer. "But every few weeks, she asks if I've heard anything about you, if you're okay, if you're taking care of yourself." Hope flared in Marco's chest, painful and dangerous. She does? Don't get excited. She still doesn't want to see you. But I think, maybe, she's starting to process starting to separate the grief over Sophia from the anger at you. Catherine stopped next to Sophia's grave, looking down at the headstone. My granddaughter should be 6 months old right now, learning to sit up, eating solid foods, discovering the world. I know, Marco said quietly. I think about that every day, what she'd be doing, what milestones we'd be celebrating. Catherine was quiet for a moment. I hated you, you know. For months, I hated you with everything in me. I wanted you to suffer the way my daughter suffered. I am suffering. I know. I can see it. You've lost. Weight. You look older. Broken. She turned to face him. But you're also here. Every month, like clockwork, bringing flowers to a daughter you never got to hold. That means something. It doesn't bring her back. No, it doesn't. But it shows that you're trying to honor her memory. That matters, even if it doesn't fix anything. Marco's throat tightened. How is Isabel? Really? She has good days and bad days. The good days are getting more frequent, but the bad ones are still terrible. She wakes up crying sometimes, saying she can hear the phone ringing and ringing with no answer. She has nightmares about bleeding alone. The trauma runs deep, Marco. I did that to her. Yes, you did. And you can't undo it. But, Catherine hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a letter. She wrote this 3 weeks ago. She hasn't been able to bring herself to send it. I'm supposed to be giving it to you? She'd be furious if she knew. But I think maybe you need to read it. And I think maybe she needs you to have read it. Marco took the letter with shaking hands. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I don't know what it says, and I'm not promising anything. But Marco, if you're really trying to change, if you're really becoming someone different, then maybe there's a path forward, not back to what you had. That's gone forever, but forward to something new. She turned to leave, then paused. She's coming home next month, to the city, not to your penthouse. She's getting her own place, starting to rebuild her life. If you're going to reach out, that would be the time. But Marco, I swear to you, if you hurt her again, there won't be anywhere in this world you can hide from me. After Catherine left, Marco sat back down in the grass, holding the letter like it was made of glass. His hands trembled as he carefully opened the envelope. The handwriting was Isabel's, elegant and precise, though shakier than he remembered. Marco, I've written this letter 17 times. Once for each call you didn't answer. Each time, I've tried to find the right words to explain what I'm feeling. But there aren't right words for this. There aren't words for what it's like to lose your child while begging for help that never comes. I'm angry at you. I think I'll always be angry at you. At least a little bit. You failed me when I needed you most. You failed Sophia before she ever had a chance to be disappointed by you. That's a fact I have to live with every single day. But I'm also angry at myself. For not being stronger. For not calling 911 sooner. For spending so many months making excuses for your absence instead of demanding better. For believing that your love was enough, even when your actions showed me it wasn't. My therapist says I need to forgive myself for that. She says I need to forgive you too, eventually. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying this much anger is killing me slowly, and Sophia deserves better than 2 dead parents. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I even want to try. But I think I need to see you, face to face, to say everything I need to say, to get closure, to maybe understand why the man I loved disappeared so completely that he couldn't hear me screaming. I'm coming, back to the city next month. My therapist thinks I'm ready to face that penthouse, that bedroom, that city where everything fell apart. I don't know if I agree, but I can't hide in Maine forever. If you're willing, I'd like to meet. Somewhere neutral, somewhere that isn't full of ghosts. We can talk, really talk, in a way we never did during our marriage. And maybe we can both find a way to live with what happened, or maybe we can't. Maybe this meeting will just confirm that we're too broken to ever be in the same room again. But I need to try. I need to know if there's any piece of the man I married left underneath all the guilt and grief. I'm not promising anything. I'm not saying I can ever love you again or trust you again or be your wife again. I'm just saying I'm willing to listen. That's more than you gave me that night. I hope you understand how much that costs me. Isabel. Marco read the letter 3 times. tears streaming down his face, before carefully folding it and placing it against his chest. She was willing to listen. After everything he'd done, everything he'd destroyed, Isabel was giving him a chance to explain, to apologize, to maybe begin the impossible work of healing. He looked at Sophia's headstone, at his daughter's name carved in marble. "I'm going to try, baby girl," he whispered. "I'm going to try to be the man your mother deserves. The man you deserved. I know it's too late for us, but maybe it's not too late for her to find peace." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying away his words. But Marco felt something he hadn't felt in 6 months. Hope, fragile and terrifying, but hope nonetheless. The coffee shop Isabel chose was deliberately neutral, a small place in a neighborhood neither of them had ever visited, far from the penthouse, far from the hospital, far from any place that held memories of their life together. Marco arrived 30 minutes early and sat in a corner booth, nursing a coffee he couldn't taste, watching the door with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. He'd spent the last month preparing for this meeting, rehearsing what he'd say, then discarding every practice speech because none of them felt adequate for the enormity of what he needed to express. How do you apologize for letting your daughter die? How do you ask forgiveness for trauma you caused? How do you explain that you'd become a monster without even realizing it? At exactly 3 o'clock, Isabel walked through the door. Marco's breath caught. She looked different, thinner, her dark hair cut shorter, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of the elegant dresses she used to. Favor. But it was her eyes that struck him most. They held a wariness, a guardedness that had never been there before. She looked like someone who'd survived something terrible and was still deciding whether surviving had been worth it. She spotted him and hesitated for just a moment before walking to his booth. He stood immediately, awkwardly, unsure if he should offer to hug her or shake her hand or just sit back down. "Hello, Marco," she said quietly, sliding into the seat across from him. "Bella Isabel," he corrected himself, remembering she'd forbidden the nickname. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." She ordered tea when the waitress came by, her hands wrapped around the warm cup like she needed comfort. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that needed to be said and the impossibility of saying it. "You look different," Isabel finally said. "Older. I am older. We both are. Grief does that, I think. How have you been?" The question was automatic, polite, the kind of thing you ask strangers. "Terrible," Marco answered honestly. "Empty, broken. Every word that describes someone who destroyed, everything that mattered, and has to live with that knowledge." Isabel flinched slightly at his bluntness. "I didn't come here for you to punish yourself in front of me. Then why did you come?" She was quiet for a moment, staring into her tea. "I need to understand. My therapist keeps asking me questions I can't answer. How could the man who pursued me so relentlessly, who said I was the most important thing in his life, become someone who couldn't hear me screaming? How does that transformation happen?" "Slowly," Marco said, his voice rough with emotion. "So slowly you don't notice it happening. Each late night, each missed dinner. I justified them all as temporary, but they never were." "No," Isabel agreed quietly. "They never were. The business was easy," Marco continued. "Clear rules, measurable results. Being a husband was hard. Being a father was terrifying. So I hid in what I knew and told myself I was doing it for us." Isabel's eyes filled with tears. "I needed you, Marco. Not your money, not your power, just you. Present and attentive and there. And you chose the easy path over and over until the hard path disappeared completely." "I know," he whispered. "And I will regret that choice every day for the rest of my life." "Tell me about that night," she said suddenly. "I need to hear it from you. What were you thinking? What was so important that you—" Her voice broke. "Did you let our daughter die?" Marco closed his eyes. The memory of that night, still vivid and painful. The Valencio deal. 5 years of negotiation, expansion into new territories, hundreds of millions of dollars. The call was supposed to be the final negotiation. The moment everything came together. Was it worth it? No. God, no. I canceled the deal the next day. Gave it all to my competitors. Because you were right, what's the point of an empire if your family isn't there to share it? Isabel stared at him. "You gave it up?" "I gave up everything, Isabel. I stepped back from most of the business. I sold properties, liquidated assets. I kept enough to live on and to take care of you. But the rest? It meant nothing. None of it meant anything once I understood what it had cost. You can't buy forgiveness, Marco. You can't throw money at this and make it go away. I know. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to tell you that you were right. About everything. The business destroyed our marriage. My ambition killed our daughter. And I will never, never forgive myself for that. Tears were streaming down Isabel's face now. Do you know what that felt like? Calling for help over and over, knowing you were there, and getting nothing but silence? I didn't hear it, Marco said, his own tears starting. I had my phone on silent, and I was so focused. You heard me screaming. Isabel's voice rose, drawing looks from other patrons. And you heard nothing? You expect me to believe that? Marco wanted to lie, to make excuses, but Dr. Brennan's voice echoed in his mind. The truth. Always the truth, no matter how damning. I heard something, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Around 8:30, I heard sounds from the bedroom. Raised voices or crying, I couldn't tell. And he forced himself to continue. I closed my office door more firmly because the noise was distracting me from the call. Isabel made a sound like she'd been shot. You heard me and closed the door. I thought it was the television. I thought you were watching a movie too loudly. I didn't think. You didn't think. She was sobbing. Now, her whole body shaking. Our daughter was dying and you thought I was watching television too loudly. So you closed the door to have better concentration for your business call. I know, Marco said, tears streaming down his face. I know how terrible that sounds. I know there's no excuse. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times, wondering what would have happened if I'd just gotten up and checked, if I'd just opened the door instead of closing it. Sophia would be alive. You wouldn't have this trauma. Our family would still exist. But you didn't open the door, Isabel said, her voice hollow. You chose the call, just like you'd been choosing the business over us for years. This time it just had permanent consequences. They sat in silence, both crying, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a coffee shop, while discussing the most extraordinary pain imaginable. I've been going to therapy, Marco said finally. 3 times a week, trying to understand how I became someone capable of that level of negligence. Trying to change. Change doesn't bring her back. No, it doesn't. Nothing brings her back. But Isabel, I need you to know that I loved Sophia. I still love her. Every day I visit her grave. Every day I tell her I'm sorry. Every day I try to become the father she deserved, even though she'll never know it. Isabel looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. What do you want from me, Marco? Why did you want this meeting? I wanted to tell. All of it, without excuses or justifications. I wanted you to hear me say that you were right about everything. And I wanted... He hesitated. I wanted you to know that I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I am asking for permission to keep trying to be better. To honor Sophia's memory by becoming the man she should have had as a father. And us? Isabel asked quietly. What about us? Marco's heart clenched, but he forced himself to answer honestly. There is no us, Isabel. Not anymore. That marriage died with Sophia. You can't trust me, and I can't blame you. I just want you to be able to heal without carrying all this alone. If there's anything I can do to help that process, even if it's staying away forever, I'll do it. Isabel was quiet for a long time, her tea growing cold in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful, measured. I don't know if I can forgive you. My therapist says forgiveness is a process, not a destination, and that some wounds never fully heal. But I think maybe I can try to understand, to see you as a deeply flawed man who made a catastrophic mistake, rather than as a monster who didn't care. I'm not sure there's a difference, Marco said bitterly. There is. Monsters don't cry at their daughter's grave every month. Monsters don't give up their empire out of guilt. Monsters don't go to therapy 3 times a week. She met his eyes. You're not a monster, Marco. You're just a man who broke something precious and can't figure out how to glue the pieces back together, because they can't be glued back together. No, she agreed. They can't. But maybe we can learn to live with the broken pieces. Separately, probably. But without this much anger and pain. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something a tiny opening in the wall between them. An acknowledgement that he was human rather than evil. I'm going back to work next month, Isabel continued. Event planning, like I used to do before we got married. I need to rebuild my life, my identity outside of being your wife or Sophia's mother. I need to remember who I was before everything fell apart. That's good, Marco said sincerely. You were brilliant at that work. I remember. Do you? You never seemed to pay much attention to my career. The accusations stung because it was true. I'm sorry. I should have supported you more. Should have celebrated your successes instead of dismissing them as less important than mine. Isabel nodded slowly. I have a question, and I need you to answer honestly. That mistress you had. I never had a mistress, Marco interrupted firmly. I swear to you, Isabel. I was faithful to our marriage, even if I wasn't present in it. Every night I was away was business, not pleasure. I know that doesn't make it better, but I need you to know I never betrayed you that way. She studied his face, searching for lies. Okay, I believe you. I don't know why, but I do. They talked for another hour, carefully navigating the minefield of their shared history. Isabel told him about her therapy, about learning to manage her PTSD symptoms, about the nightmares that still woke her up some nights. Marco told her about his own therapy, about the grief support groups, about selling off pieces of his empire. I'm keeping the cemetery plot next to Sophia, Marco said as they were preparing to leave. When I die, I want to be buried beside our daughter. If that's okay with you. Isabel's eyes filled with fresh tears. That's the first time you've called her our daughter instead of avoiding the possessive. As if you don't have the right to claim her. I don't have the right. But she was mine, at least in biology. And I love her, even though I failed her. She was ours, Isabel said softly. And we both failed her, in different ways. I failed by not leaving you sooner, by not demanding better, by accepting scraps of attention instead of requiring presence. You failed by not being there when it mattered most. Our failures just had different consequences. Don't do that, Marco said urgently. Don't take responsibility for my neglect. This was my fault, Isabel. You didn't fail anyone. Maybe we both failed, she said. Maybe that's the truth we both need to accept. That we were both broken in different ways, and our daughter paid the price. As they left the coffee shop, standing on the sidewalk in the fading afternoon light, Isabel turned to him one more time. I'm not ready to see you again, she said. Not for a while. But Marco, maybe eventually, maybe once I'm more healed, once I've rebuilt my life, we could try to be friends. Not lovers, probably never that again. But two people who share grief and want to honor their daughter's memory together. I would like that, Marco said, his voice thick with emotion. More than you know. Goodbye, Marco. She hesitated, then did something that shocked them both. She hugged him, briefly, carefully, like she was embracing something fragile that might shatter. Thank you for being honest today. It doesn't fix anything, but it helps to understand. Goodbye, Isabel. He whispered into her hair, breathing in her familiar scent one last time. Thank you for giving me this chance to explain. He watched her walk away, her figure disappearing into the city crowd. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a beginning, the first small step on a very long road toward healing. The anniversary of Sophia's death arrived with cold rain, the kind that soaked through clothes and chilled to the bone. Marco stood at her grave with an umbrella, laying fresh flowers on the small headstone. Happy birthday, baby girl, he said softly. You would have been 1 year old today, learning to walk, saying your first words, destroying everything in your path with that curiosity that all toddlers have. He'd been coming here every week for the past year, talking to his daughter, updating her on his life, trying to be the father she'd never known. The changes in his life had been profound. He'd fully stepped away from his criminal operations, keeping only legitimate businesses that didn't require violence or intimidation. He'd donated millions to pregnancy loss research and support organizations. He'd volunteered at a crisis hotline, talking to people in their darkest moments, making sure they knew someone was listening. He'd become, slowly and painfully, a better man. Not because it would bring Sophia back or win Isabel back, but because it was the right thing to do. Your mother is doing better, he told the grave. She got a promotion at work last month. She's building a life for herself. I see her sometimes at events she's planning. I make sure to attend when I know she'll be there, just to see that she's okay. We don't talk much. A polite greeting, maybe a brief conversation about you. But she smiles sometimes now, Sophia. Real smiles, not the empty ones from before. She smiles, because she knows you're watching over her. Marco turned to find Isabel standing a few feet away, also holding flowers, also soaked by rain. They stared at each other for a moment. Then she walked forward and knelt at Sophia's grave, placing her flowers next to his. I didn't know you'd be here, Marco said. I come every week, Isabel replied. Different days than you usually, but today felt important. Her birthday. They knelt together in the rain, two broken people united by shared grief, both silently speaking to the daughter they'd lost. I saw you at the Harrington wedding last month, Isabel said finally. You bid $20,000 on that silent auction item to support the children's hospital. It was for a good cause. It was generous. She looked at him. You've changed, Marco. Really changed. I've been watching you, not in a creepy way, just noticing. The man I see now is different from the man I married. I had to change. Staying the same would have meant Sophia died for nothing. Isabel was quiet for a moment. My therapist says I'm ready to try forgiveness. Not forgetting I'll never forget. Hope flared in Marco's chest. But he kept his voice steady. That's good, Isabel. You deserve peace. I've been thinking, she continued, her eyes still on Sophia's grave, about what you said. About honoring her memory, by being better. I've been so focused on my own healing that I haven't thought much about legacy. About making sure Sophia's brief life meant something. She meant everything, Marco said fiercely. Even though I failed her, even though I never got to hold her, she was everything. I want to start a foundation, Isabel said suddenly. Sophia's foundation. To support pregnant women in crisis. To provide resources, therapy, medical care. To make sure that other women don't have to go through what I went through, suffering alone, unsupported, terrified. Marco felt tears streaming down his face, mixing with rain. That's beautiful, Isabel. That's perfect. I want you to help, she continued, looking at him now. Not just with money, though we'll need that, but with your time, your attention, your presence. I want us to build something together that honors our daughter, not as husband and wife, but as two people who love the same child and want her short life to have meaning. Yes, Marco said immediately. Yes, absolutely. Whatever you need, however much time it takes, I'll be there. I need to know you'll show up, Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly. That if I call you, you'll answer. That if we schedule a meeting, you'll be there. That time, I can count on you. Marco reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened his settings and showed her. See this? Every call from you has a special ringtone. Loud enough that I'll hear it anywhere, anytime. And see this app? It tracks every commitment I make, sends me reminders, holds me accountable. He pulled out a small leather journal. And this. Every day, I write down my priorities. Every day, the first line is the same. Honor Sophia by being present for what matters. Isabel's eyes filled with tears. You really have changed. I had to. I destroyed everything because I had my priorities backwards. I won't make that mistake again. They stood, together in the rain, looking at Sophia's grave, and something shifted between them. Not love that would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all, but partnership, purpose, a shared commitment to making meaning from tragedy. Tell me about the foundation, Marco said. What's your vision? They talked for an hour in the rain, their voices animated with plans and possibilities. Support groups for women with high-risk pregnancies, therapy services for those who'd experienced loss, emergency funds for medical care, hotline staffed 24/7, educational programs about recognizing complications, and relationships counseling, Isabel added, for couples struggling with the stress of pregnancy and new parenthood. So maybe other marriages don't fall apart the way ours did. That's important, Marco agreed, learning to communicate before a crisis hits. As the rain finally began to slow, Isabel looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen in over a year, something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't mistrust either. Something like possibility. I'm not ready to be friends yet, she said. Not real friends. The kind who have coffee and share their lives. But maybe we can be partners in this. Maybe working together to honor Sophia will help us both heal. I'll take whatever you're willing to give, Marco said honestly. Partnership is more than I deserve. Stop that, she said firmly. Stop punishing yourself. Sophia wouldn't want that. She'd today want you to be better, to do better, to make sure her death meant something. So focus on that instead of flagellating yourself. You're right. He smiled slightly. You always were right. I should have listened more. Yes, you should have. But there was the tiniest hint of warmth in her voice. Now. Not forgiveness, but acceptance. Acknowledgement that they were both human, both flawed, both trying. 2 years after Sophia's death, her foundation officially launched on what would have been her second birthday. The ceremony was held in a community center, attended by dozens of families who'd experienced pregnancy loss, medical professionals who specialized in high-risk pregnancies, and donors who believed in the mission. Marco stood to the side, letting Isabel take center stage. This was her vision, her passion, her way of transforming grief into purpose. He was just there to support her, to make sure she had everything she needed. My daughter Sophia lived for 8 months inside me, Isabel told the gathered crowd, her voice strong and clear. She never took a breath outside my body, never opened her eyes to see the world. But her life mattered, and her death taught. Tell me something important about the value of presence, support, and showing up when it matters most. She talked about her experience, the loneliness, the fear, the trauma of suffering through a crisis alone. She talked about the importance of emotional support during pregnancy, about partners being present, about communities rallying around vulnerable mothers. Sophia's foundation exists to make sure no woman faces pregnancy complications alone, she concluded. We can't prevent every tragedy, but we can ensure that every woman has support, resources, and people who will answer when she calls for help. The crowd applauded, and Marco watched Isabel glow with purpose and pride. She'd transformed her grief into something meaningful, something that would help thousands of women. She'd become even stronger than she'd been before, not in spite of what happened, but because of how she'd chosen to respond to it. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared stories, Isabel found Marco in the corner where he'd been talking to a therapist who wanted to volunteer. Over the past 2 years of working together, something had shifted between them. The raw wounds had begun to scar. Over, replaced by a cautious partnership built on shared purpose. Thank you for being here, she said. Always, he replied. Every meeting, every event, every time you need me, that's my promise. I know. She smiled a real smile, warm and genuine. You've kept every promise you've made for the past 6 months. Every phone call was answered. Every meeting was attended. Every commitment is honored. I won't fail you again, Isabel. I'm starting to believe that. She hesitated, then said something that made Marco's heart skip. Would you like to have dinner? Nothing romantic, just 2 people who work together sharing a meal and discussing the foundation's future. I would love that, Marco said carefully. Are you sure? I'm sure. My therapist thinks I'm ready to expand our partnership beyond just foundation work, to try being in each other's presence without it being painful. We'll never be what we were, Marco, but maybe we can be something new. 3 years later, the foundation's annual gala was held in a ballroom overlooking the city, attended by hundreds of supporters. Sophia's foundation had helped over 500 families in its first 2 years, providing therapy, medical care, support groups, and emergency assistance. Isabel moved through the crowd with confidence and grace, the woman she'd been before the tragedy, but stronger, wiser, more purposeful. Marco watched her from across the room, proud of what she'd built, grateful to be part of it. Over 3 years, they'd settled into a partnership that worked for both of them. They had dinner once a week to discuss foundation business. They attended events together. They visited Sophia's grave on important dates. But they maintained separate lives, separate homes, careful boundaries that protected Isabel's healing process. The romantic relationship they'd once shared remained firmly in the past until recently, when Isabel had begun to wonder if it had to stay there. It wasn't a marriage, but it was something. She's remarkable, Catherine said, appearing at Marco's elbow. His former mother-in-law had become a reluctant ally over the past 2 years, seeing how much he'd changed and appreciating his dedication to Sophia's memory. She always was, Marco replied. I just failed to appreciate it when it mattered. You're doing better now, Catherine acknowledged. Not perfect, but better. That's all any of us can ask. Near the end of the evening, Isabel found Marco on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. "Successful event," he said. "Very. We raised enough to expand into 3 more cities." She joined him at the railing. Sophia would be 3. 9 years old now, talking in full sentences, probably asking a million questions and refusing to sleep. "She'd be beautiful," Marco said. "Like her mother." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Isabel said something that surprised him. "I've been thinking about the future. About what comes next. For the foundation? For me. For us." She turned to face him. "Marco, I've forgiven you. Not completely, I don't know if that's possible. But enough. Enough to let go of the anger. Enough to see you as a partner rather than the person who caused my trauma." "Isabel, I'm not saying I want to get back together," she clarified quickly. "I don't know if I could ever be your wife again. Too much has happened. Too many wounds that haven't fully healed. But I think maybe we could be friends. Real friends, not just colleagues working together." "I would like that," Marco said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you know. We'll go slowly. Coffee dates, not business dinners. Conversations about life, not just the foundation. Getting to know each other again as the people we've become, not the people we were. Whatever pace you're comfortable with," Marco promised. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here, present and consistent, for as long as you'll let me." Isabel smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, Marco saw a glimpse of the woman he'd fallen in love with, not unchanged by tragedy, but transformed by it into someone even more remarkable. "You know what Sophia taught me?" Isabel said. "That sometimes the worst things in life can lead to the most important changes. I wouldn't wish what happened on anyone, but if she hadn't died, I wouldn't have built this foundation. I wouldn't have found this purpose, and you wouldn't have become the man standing next to me right now. She gave us both a terrible, precious gift," Marco agreed. "The opportunity to be better than we were." "To Sophia," Isabel said, raising her glass. "To Sophia," Marco echoed. "The daughter we'll never stop loving, and the catalyst for the people we needed to become." They clinked glasses under the stars. 2 people bound by shared grief and shared purpose, no longer husband and wife, but something, perhaps more important, 2 souls who'd survived tragedy and chosen growth over bitterness, meaning over despair. The road had been long and painful. The destination was still unclear, but they were walking it together, one careful step at a time, honoring the memory of the daughter they'd lost by becoming the people she deserved. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. The small house in the suburbs was nothing like the penthouse Marco had once called home. It was modest, warm, filled with photographs and memories instead of expensive art and designer furniture. Isabel stood in the doorway, keys in hand, looking at the space that would be her new beginning. After 5 years of living alone, of maintaining careful boundaries, she decided to take a leap that terrified and excited her in equal measure. She was selling her apartment and buying this house, and Marco, her partner in the foundation, her friend, her former husband, was helping her move in. "Kitchen's through here," the realtor said cheerfully. "And the backyard is perfect for a swing set," Isabel finished softly. "For a child." Marco looked at her sharply from where he was carrying boxes. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't even hinted at it. After Sophia, the topic of children had been too painful to approach. Later, after the realtor left and they were unpacking kitchen supplies, Marco finally asked the question, "Are you thinking about adopting?" Isabel set down the mug she'd been unwrapping and looked at him. "I'm thinking about trying again. Having another baby. Not to replace Sophia, nothing could replace her. But to honor her memory by creating new life." "That's beautiful," Marco said carefully. "Do you have someone? Are you seeing someone?" "No," she said quietly. "I haven't dated anyone since you. Haven't wanted to. But I'm 34, Marco. If I want to be a mother, I need to decide soon. And I've been thinking." She trailed off, seeming unsure. "Thinking what?" "That maybe we could try again. Not marriage. Not yet. Maybe never. But a relationship. A real one. Where we take things slowly. Where we communicate. Where we both show up. And if that works, if we can build something healthy and strong, then maybe we could try to have another child. Together." Marco felt tears spring to his eyes. "Isabel, I don't deserve." "Stop," she interrupted firmly. "Stop saying you don't deserve things. You've spent 5 years proving you're a different person. You've been present, consistent, honest. You've built a life focused on helping others. You've honored Sophia's memory in every way possible. But what if I fail again? What if I become that person who prioritizes work over family? Then I'll leave, Isabel said simply. And this time, I won't wait months to do it. I've learned to value myself, Marco. I know what I deserve now. And if you can't give me that, I'll walk away without hesitation. You should, Marco agreed. You should have walked away years ago. Maybe. But I didn't, and here we are. 5 years later, both of us changed. Both of us. Better. And I find myself wondering if maybe the universe gave us this terrible lesson because we were supposed to learn it. Because the people we would have been otherwise weren't good enough for each other or for the family we wanted to build. Marco set down his own box and walked over to her, taking her hands carefully, as if she might break. If you're willing to try, if you're willing to give me a chance to be the husband I should have been from the beginning, I promise you this, I will show up, every single day, every phone call, every dinner, every moment. You and any child we have, together will always, always come first. I know, Isabel said, and the trust in her eyes nearly undid him. That's why I'm willing to try. They didn't kiss. The moment felt too fragile for that, too important. Instead, they stood in the kitchen of Isabel's new house, holding hands, both of them crying, both of them scared and hopeful in equal measure. We'll go slowly, Isabel said. Dating first. Real dating, getting to know each other again. Then maybe moving in together. Then maybe, if everything works out, we can talk about marriage and babies and all the things we rushed into. Before. Whatever pace you need, Marco promised. I'm not going anywhere. And he kept that promise. For 2 years, they dated coffee shops and museums, long walks and quiet dinners. They went to couples therapy together, learning to communicate in ways they never had before. They celebrated when Isabel said yes to his second proposal, this time understanding exactly what marriage required. They moved into the suburban house together, blending their lives slowly and intentionally. When Isabel became pregnant again, they were both terrified and grateful. This time, Marco attended every appointment. This time, he was present. The hospital room was nothing like the one from 8 years ago. This time, it was filled with warmth and laughter and anticipation. This time, Marco held Isabel's hand through every contraction, breathing with her, supporting her, being present in every possible way. This time, when their daughter entered the world with a strong, healthy cry, both parents were there to witness it. She's perfect, Isabel breathed, cradling the tiny infant against her chest. She is, Marco agreed, his voice thick with emotion. Absolutely perfect. They named her Elena Rose. Elena meaning light, because she represented the light that had slowly returned to their lives after years of darkness. But her middle name was Rose, like Sophia's had been, a way of keeping both daughters connected across the divide between life and death. Hello, Elena, Marco whispered, touching his daughter's tiny hand. I'm your daddy, and I promise you, I will be here for every moment, every laugh, every tear, every milestone. You will never doubt that you're loved. Isabel watched him with Elena, seeing the transformation that 8 years had wrought. This was a different man from the one she'd married, humbled by failure, strengthened by grief, committed in ways the younger Marco couldn't have understood. Do you think Sophia knows? Isabel asked softly. That she has a little sister? I think she knows, Marco replied. And I think she's happy, for us. Happy that her death led to all this growth, all this change. Happy that we didn't let grief destroy us completely. Catherine arrived an hour later, tears streaming down her face as she held her granddaughter. She's beautiful. Both of them are beautiful, Elena here with us, and Sophia, watching over her. Over the next few days, as they adjusted to life with a newborn, Marco proved every promise he'd made. He changed diapers, gave bottles during night feedings, and soothed Elena when she cried. Most importantly, he was present not on his phone, not distracted by business, but fully engaged with his family. One night, as Isabel was nursing Elena, Marco pulled out his phone to show her something. Look at this, he said. Sophia's foundation has now helped over 10,000 families. 10,000 women who didn't have to suffer alone because our daughter's short life inspired something meaningful. Isabel looked at the statistics, tears streaming down her face. She saved so many people, Marco. Our little girl who never took a breath outside my body has saved thousands of families from experiencing what we experienced. She's our guardian angel, Marco. Agreed. Watching over Elena, watching over us, making sure we stay on the right path. 13 years after Sofia's death, the dedication ceremony for the Foundation's new headquarters was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the organization. Marco and Isabel stood, together, their hands intertwined, watching as Elena, now 8 years old and full of questions about the sister she'd never met, helped unveil the plaque. Sophia Rose Delacroix Memorial Foundation. In loving memory of a daughter who taught us that presence is the greatest gift, 2015. To 2015. Mommy, was Sophia really my sister? Elena asked, looking up at Isabel with curious eyes. Yes, sweetheart, Isabel said, kneeling down to her daughter's level. She was your big sister, and even though she couldn't stay with us, she loved you very much. How do you know if she never met me? Because love isn't just about being there in person, Isabel explained. It's about the impact you have on people's lives. Sophia changed Daddy and me. She made us better people. And because of that, we were ready to be good parents when you came along. Elena considered this seriously. So she's like my guardian angel? Exactly like that, Marco said, his voice thick with emotion. That evening, after the ceremony, after Elena had been put to bed, Marco and Isabel stood on the porch of their home, a real home now, full of love and laughter and the ordinary chaos of family life. Do you have regrets? Isabel asked, leaning against him. About Sophia? Every day. I regret that I never got to hold her, never got to be her father, never got to show her how much I loved her. But about us? About the path we took to get here? Marco was quiet for a moment, considering. I regret the pain. We both suffered. I regret the months you spent alone and afraid. I regret every moment of your trauma. But Isabel, if that terrible night hadn't happened, I would still be that man negligent, absent, convinced that business was more important than family. I wouldn't be the husband you deserve. I wouldn't be the father Elena needs. So Sophia's death was necessary? Isabel's voice held a hint of old pain. No. God, no. I would give anything to have her here, to have both our daughters healthy and whole. But since I can't change what happened, since I can't bring her back, the only thing I can do is make sure her death meant something. Make sure I learned the lesson she taught me. Isabel nodded, understanding. They'd had this conversation many times over the years, navigating the complex emotions of grief and growth, loss and love. I forgive you, she said suddenly. Completely, finally, fully. I forgive you for that night, for your neglect, for all of it. Marco looked at her in shock. Bella, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I want to. We've built a beautiful life together, Marco. We have Elena. We have the foundation. We have each other. Holding on to anger about the past doesn't serve anyone, especially not Sophia's memory. I love you, Marco said, pulling her close. I never stopped loving you, even when you hated me, even when I hated myself. I love you too, Isabel replied. The man you've become, the father you are to be, Elena, the partner you've been in honoring Sophia. All of it. They stood together on their porch, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, two people who'd been broken by tragedy and rebuilt by love, commitment, and the daily choice to show up for each other. Inside, Elena slept peacefully, her room decorated with pictures of the sister she'd never met, but whose presence shaped every aspect of her life. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when they leave this world, Sophia Rose Delacroix watched over her family, the catalyst for transformation, the angel who'd taught her parents, the most important lesson of all, that love isn't measured in grand gestures or expensive gifts. It's measured in answered phone calls, in presence during crisis, in showing up day after day even when it's hard. It's measured in the willingness to change, to grow, to become better than you were, and it's measured in the legacy you leave behind, the lives you touch, the people you help, the love you inspire in others. Sophia's life had been brief, but her impact was eternal, and that, Marco and Isabel both knew, was the greatest gift their daughter could have given them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story of loss, redemption, and second chances, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.